Shabbat Shalom. I hope that you've had a good week, but even if you haven't, it's Shabbat, a time to thank God for all that you have and all that you are, and to look forward to another week. Today, we are looking at Parasha Vayera, and this name is from the root to see. It relates to vision and to one who is a visionary. It's interesting to note, I believe, that only in the scriptures, among all the world's so-called holy books, are we allowed to see people, righteous people, godly people, people whom we admire, like the patriarchs and matriarchs, to see them as they really are, and not as icons of perfection. Our forefathers and mothers were ultimately proved righteous by their actions, by their obedience to God, but they were certainly not perfect. They weren't always right. They weren't always holy. They were human. And of course, that gives us hope. It is only God's standard of righteousness revealed to our people, which in the end set the godly apart from the wicked. Pardon me. His standards were made known to those who sought to know him. From the earliest times, even before Noach, but certainly we see this with Noach and with Avraham. And of course his mishpatim were eventually written down in the tablets of the Torah. His righteousness is recognized and avowed by our prophets. Avraham Avinu, our father Avraham, what is his legacy to us? In Parasha Vayera, we read of two episodes in the life of Avraham involving Avimelech. Now this is a title, and it literally means father king. He was the king of the Fleischer, the Philistines. When Avraham arrived in Avimelech's land, Avimelech took Sarah into his household. He didn't realize she was a married woman, and obviously he thought nothing of simply taking a woman who belonged to another. Later in the parasha, Avimelech approached Avraham, suggesting that they enter into a treaty together. But Avraham was forced to confront him concerning the wells that Avimelech's servants had stolen. Although these two events may appear unrelated, as we analyze them, we see a relationship between these seemingly dissimilar issues. Looking beyond the obvious, we see that twice Avimelech, the king of his nation, the leader of his people, is party to a sin which involves theft. In the first case, Sarah is taken from her family, and it really doesn't matter whether she is Avraham's wife or not. Surely this would be considered an affront. And in the second narrative, the king's servants take possession of wells which properly belong to Avraham and his household. Both acts are, of course, led by the evil inclination. Basic and fundamental violation of laws commonly held even before the commandments of God were given to govern our relationships with others. People know that stealing is wrong. But kings were considered to be above the law. In fact, they made the law, and they could unmake it just as easily. And down until almost modern times, this was considered the way things were. Avimelech is confronted with these wrongful acts. Both would have been considered misappropriation of another's property. What is his response? It's nearly the same in both incidents. When Hashem appears to him, yes, Hashem appeared to him and accused him of taking Sarah. He responds by rejecting any wrongdoing on the basis that he didn't know she was the wife of Avraham. But that still makes him a thief. Confronted by Avraham regarding the theft of the wells, Avimelech again pleads that he cannot be held responsible. He was ignorant of the wrongful acts of his servants. Although Avimelech pleads ignorance and no fault on his part in both cases, Avraham's response to him is interesting, perhaps a bit surprising. Concerning the theft of Sarah, Avraham tells Avimelech that his actions were prompted by the evil inclination due to the spiritual climate prevailing in the land of the Pelishtim. Rak ein yiras Elokim b'makom hazeh. There is no fear of Hashem in this place. Wow. That's something. There is no fear of God, of the one true God in this place. And that's why you do what you do. And forced to confront Avimelech yet again regarding the theft of the wells, Avraham does not elaborate on this sin because he's already identified the root cause of both thefts. And so there's no need to repeat the message. The evidence is indisputable. A society that lacks fear of the one true God and which will permit the theft of a human being will certainly condone the misappropriation of another's property. How does Rak ein yiras Elokim explain a breach of moral conduct? Humanists, including those who are Christians or Jews, believe that without Yiras Hashem, a society that respects other people's rights is still possible. That's what they believe. The majority of people around us believe that you don't have to believe in God in order to have ethics. Certainly the atheists and agnostics believe this. There's even an organization that I know of that was very popular earlier in the 20th century called Ethical Culture. It was basically religion without God. It was the idea that one could be just as ethical and moral and not believe in God. How does that work exactly? Well, it doesn't. This premise of humanism, that humanity is basically moral and does not need God or his instructions, and certainly not the fear of God to make us so. Avraham's words dispel this unsubstantiated notion with his stinging reply to Avimelech. The root cause of an unethical, immoral, or corrupt society, then and now, is the absence of Yiras Hashem. There's no fear of God. In such a society, there's a void, a vacuum, when it comes to the catalyst that is necessary for morality and respect for others to flourish. Avimelech, as the ruler of his society, was ultimately responsible for the spiritual and moral character and the atmosphere of his kingdom. While it may have been true that he didn't know that Sarah was married to Avraham, he certainly knew that she was either a free woman or the property of another man. As with the wells, it was Avimelech's responsibility to set the standards for his employees and for his kingdom. His servants should have known right from wrong, and they should have been certain that wrongdoing would not go unpunished by Avimelech. But of course, they knew nothing of the kind. In an atmosphere devoid of Yiras Hashem, Avimelech could act as he chose and make such rulings as he liked without restraint. And he would permit similar actions on the part of those who served him. In a society permeated with fear of God, one need not be afraid that he will be killed so that his wife can be taken by another. In an atmosphere of Yiras Hashem, it is inconceivable to steal another man's wife or his wells. These two occurrences expose the fundamental flaw in the kingdom of Avimelech, for which he is held personally responsible and accountable. Avimelech, the ruler of a land without fear of the one true God, stands in sharp contrast to Avraham, who is described after the Akedas Yitzchak to be a Yirei Elokim, one who fears Hashem. This praise of Avraham is especially significant in light of what Avraham Avinu personified. He is the patriarch of the people of Israel, the people of God. Avraham is singled out for his unique commitment to God's way of doing things, even before Torah had been given to our people in written form. He is la'asos tzedakah umishpat, one who acts with righteousness and justice. The legacy of Avraham is one of performing acts of kindness to his fellow man. But the crowning glory of Avraham's life is the description of him as a Yireh Elohim, one who fears God. And surely that should be what we desire as well. In this parashah, we are presented with the Torah perspective on personal conduct. The only assurance of real commitment to true justice and kindness is a moral code that is under the imprimatur of Yiras Hashem, fear of God. If ethics and morality are defined by and subject to man, what today may be unethical may tomorrow become acceptable behavior, as we have seen for ourselves, even in the last 20 years in the UK and around the world. Torah shows us that a society will only be just and honorable if it is rooted in fear of God and his commandments. The best guarantee that Avraham would successfully transmit to his descendants his commitment to la'asos tzedakah u'mishpat, righteousness and law, was his dedication to Yiras Hashem. When Avraham's great-grandson Yosef faced his own greatest personal challenge, he drew upon the legacy of Avraham. Confronted with the temptation of the wife of Potiphar, Yosef first responded with an ethical argument, stating that to sin with Potiphar's wife would violate the trust that he had in Yosef. But finally, Yosef cried out, "How could I do this evil and sin against God?" The severity of this sin, from the vantage point of a breach of trust against a fellow human, might not be sufficient to prevent such an act, but the realization that this act would be a sin against God is the ultimate deterrent to Yosef. We, the children of Avraham, should find ourselves deterred in the same way from anything that is not in keeping with God's commandments. Fear of God should constrain us to make the right choices. Halakha declares that Yiras Hashem is the guarantee for the veracity of one's testimony, even before a bet din or any court of law. One who sins against his fellow man is not believed to behave honorably or to testify truthfully. Even the otherwise ethical individual who violates prohibitions within the realm of laws between man and God is disqualified from serving as a witness. Ethics not grounded in Yiras Hashem simply cannot be guaranteed. The survival of the legacy of Avraham can only be assured if it is adhered to in its entirety. What God says must be what we do. Dedication to the instructions of God must be based on total commitment to Yiras Hashem. It is only through this commitment that we can truly be the children of Avraham Avinu. So let's look more deeply into the legacy of our father. Avraham was a man who had both emet and bitachon. In the previous parashah, we read that Avraham heard from God directly. We don't know, but perhaps others had also heard God's voice. A well-known Bible teacher some 50 years ago said that when God called her to minister, he told her that he had called several others before her, but none of them had responded to his call. Unlike these others, of whom we do not hear, Avraham acted upon what he heard, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. God said his descendants would be as the stars of the heavens and as the sand of the seas. God said his name would be great, that it would be honored and highly regarded. God said that peoples of the earth would be blessed through him. God said Avraham and his descendants would have the land of Canaan as an eternal inheritance. Canaan, of course, the name of the grandson of Noah. Most significantly, God promised Avraham and Sarah a physical son, and it was upon this promise that all of the others are depending. Having arrived at a very old age, with no son in sight, Avraham and Sarah faced a dilemma, a sort of crossroads of faith. They had waited a long time. And now they attempted to find their own solution to the problem. God's intention was that the child of promise would not come from a concubine, but from Sarah herself. A UK delivery company has coined the phrase, "A promise is worth nothing until it is delivered." And that's just what God did. He delivered on his promise, providing Yitzchak supernaturally. Not a virgin birth, but a miraculous birth. When God fulfilled the covenant he made with Avraham and Sarah, fulfillment came in spite of the obvious physical limitations of their age. God fulfilled his commandment in spite of the momentary lapse in faith of Avraham and Sarah, which of course gives us hope. Fruition and completion of God's promises was not dependent upon their faith. It was dependent upon God's faithfulness to them. The final testing of Avraham and Sarah took place when Avraham was more than 115 years old. So many years ago, they had left their family, they'd left everything that they knew to follow God, and they had followed him for more than 40 years. God had proved his faithfulness through many trials and difficulties, some of which we read about and probably some that we know nothing about. God had blessed Avraham with wealth and had given him the son that had been promised, his only son, according to God. God placed before Avraham one last test to prove his faith. Trials, I think, are misunderstood. Testing is not given to reveal failure, but to validate our trust in God. God wanted Avraham to acknowledge that even after all this time, and after the birth of Yitzchak, the assurance that it brought with him, with this son that had been promised, God was still first in Avraham's life. And apparently, Avraham and Sarah needed to acknowledge this as well. And Yitzchak needed to see it too. He needed to see this example of his parents' faith. Who comes first in your life? This was the question that God placed before Avraham. And not only Avraham, but Yitzchak, Sarah, and their entire household. This important question needed to be answered. Did Avraham trust God for the fulfillment of all the promises? Despite Avraham's occasional lapses in faith, his total trust in God is revealed through this test. God again demonstrated his power and omnipotence, justifying Avraham's trust and planting within Yitzchak the assurance that he would need to follow God for himself as he walked in Avraham's footsteps. All of this is our legacy from Avraham. As Avraham's children, we can say firmly that God never disappoints the expectations that he raises. God is always faithful. Even when we are faithless, he will never leave us and never forsake us. He knows that we, like Avraham, may waver in our faith. We may not trust him as fully as we should, but he wants to make us strong in faith. This, however, does not excuse our failures or allow loopholes for us in the commandments given by God. For Avraham, all of the trials and difficulties he experienced, some of which showed his faith and others which demonstrated that his faith was fragile, culminate in the sacrifice of Yitzchak. Everything that had happened in his life prepared him for this event. And when this final trial came, he had been equipped by God. His faith had been strengthened in preparation to meet even this test. This is why the scriptures say of Avraham, he believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Is it likely that God would say that of you? And so the legacy of Avraham is faith. God desires the same sort of faithfulness in us. He understands, and he certainly knows, our humanity, our weaknesses, our failings. But this does not limit his expectations. The trials that he allows in our lives establish and strengthen us in faith, so that, like Avraham, we may run the race and finish the course. Rav Yaakov encourages us with these words. When all kinds of trials and temptations crowd into your lives, they do, don't they? They crowd into your life. Don't resent them as intruders. Welcome them as friends. Realize that they come to test your faith and to produce in you qualities of endurance. And let this process go on until you find that you have become people of mature character and integrity with no weak spots. And finally, from our Haftorah reading, we have the testimony of faith from a daughter of Avraham. This is the testimony of a destitute widow who came to the prophet Eliyahu. She was a worthy and godly woman, the widow of one from the school of the prophets, but in spite of this, things simply were not going well in her life. Her husband died, leaving her and her children very badly off with debts to pay and nothing with which to pay them. So she came to Eliyahu because he was the head of the school of the prophets, someone she knew, a person of authority who spoke with God. She had faith that God could provide for the debts for her and her children, and she was obviously unwilling to do what others might have done in her place, to sell one of her children into servitude. So with simple and absolute faith, she obviously believed God would act on her behalf, trusting God not only for herself, but for her children. Eliyahu had a solution, a really quite unique solution, but it related directly to the quantity and the quality of her faith. She didn't know it, but her faith was to be quite literally measured by the number of neighbors she contacted and the number of pots she managed to acquire. If she had been sparing in collecting the pots, if she had not demonstrated her faith by doing what Eliyahu said, no solution to her problem would have been provided. But because of her very simple faith, she was able to meet the needs of her household, to pay her debts, and take care of her family. As with Avraham, her action was a clear demonstration of her faith. Nothing else would have accomplished this miraculous deliverance. As Rav Yaakov declared, faith without action isn't faith at all. Faith is the conviction of realities that are unseen and unfelt, that you can't touch. Confidence in the faithfulness of God Himself and His promises. Faith is tested and tried, like Avraham's and Sarah's, and like the poor widow's, whose name we don't even know, like all children of Avraham. But look at God's patience and His love, His faithfulness, even when we, like Avraham and Sarah, make errors and mistakes. Is Avraham's legacy a reality in your life? How big is your faith? How far would you trust God with your children, with your future? How many jars would you have prepared? How far does your faith stretch? Do you have faith in God for the important things in your life? What about the little things? Do you trust God to do everything He has promised? Does your trust extend to every area, every corner of your life? Embrace the faith legacy of Avraham. Take it for your own. It is your rightful inheritance. Do this by giving God the honor and the glory due to Him. Like Avraham, fear of God is the beginning. Believe that God is faithful in every way and for every aspect in your life. Trust God for family salvation, for daily strength, for inexhaustible courage, for wholeness and satisfaction, for endless wisdom, for unfailing direction, for steadfast purpose, for parnasa, livelihood, and kavanah, intention. Have confidence in God for all that your present encompasses and for all that your future holds, here and for eternity. God expects us, as He expected Avraham, to follow through with what He has put before us. He knows that at times we may fail, but we can be sure that He will never fail us. That is the legacy of our father, Avraham. Shabbat Shalom.